what's the crucial fact? Well, let's start by, Plato starts by telling us, reminding us of what it is to remember something, or perhaps a better word would be what it is to be reminded of something by something else that resembles it but is not the thing it reminds you of. I might have a photograph of my friend Ruth, and looking at the photograph reminds me of Ruth. It brings Ruth to mind. I start thinking about Ruth. I remember various things I know about Ruth. The photograph is able to do that, is able to trigger these thoughts. But of course, the photograph is not Ruth. Right? Nobody who's thinking clearly would confuse the photograph with my friend, but the photograph resembles Ruth. It resembles Ruth well enough to remind me of her. And interestingly, it can do that even if it's not a very good photograph. You might hold up the photograph and I might say, gosh, that really doesn't look very much like Ruth, does it? Even though I see that it is a photograph of Ruth. It reminds me of her. Now, how could it be that a photograph reminds me of my friend? Well, this isn't some deep mystery. Presumably the way it works is, as I just said, it looks sort of like her. Doesn't have to look very much like her. It looks sort of like her. Your young brother or sister, my little children, can draw pictures of family members that barely look like family members. My niece drew a picture of my family once when she was 3. Didn't look very much like us at all, but we could sort of see the resemblance in a vague kind of way, right? So it's got to look at least somewhat like the missing friend. But that's not enough. You've never met Ruth, let's suppose. I hold up the photograph without having told you anything about her. The photograph's not going to remind you of Ruth. Why not? Well, you don't know Ruth. So the pieces we need are not only an image of Ruth, even if an imperfect image of Ruth, we also need some prior acquaintance with Ruth. That's pretty much what it takes, right? So on the one hand, sort of temporal sequence. First, you know Ruth. You meet Ruth. You get to know Ruth. Then, at a later time, you're shown an image of Ruth. Maybe not even an especially good image of Ruth, but good enough to remind you. And suddenly, you're remembering things you know about Ruth. That's how recollection works. All right. Now, Plato points out that we all know things about the Platonic forms. But the Platonic forms, as we also know, are not to be found in this world. The number 3 is not a physical object. Perfect roundness is not a physical object. Perfect goodness is not a physical object. We can think about these things, our mind can grasp them, but they're not to be found in this world. Yet, various things that we do find in this world get us thinking about those things. I look at the plate on my kitchen table. It's not perfectly round, it's got imperfections, but suddenly I start thinking about circles, perfectly round objects. I look at somebody who's pretty. He or she is not perfectly beautiful, but suddenly I start thinking about the nature of beauty itself. Ordinary objects in the world participate to a greater or lesser degree in the Platonic forms. That's Plato's picture of metaphysics. And we bump up against, we look at, we have interactions with these everyday objects, and somehow they get us thinking about the Platonic forms themselves. How does it happen? Plato has a theory. He says these things remind us of the Platonic forms. We see something that's beautiful to some degree, and it reminds us of perfect beauty. We see something that's more or less round, and it reminds us of perfect circularity. We see somebody who's fairly decent morally, and it reminds us of perfect justice or perfect virtue. It's just like the photograph, perhaps the not very good photograph, that reminds me of my friend Ruth. All right, well, there's an explanation of how it could be that things that are not themselves perfectly round could remind us, could make us think about perfect roundness. But then Plato says, okay, but keep in mind all of what you need in order to have reminding, to have recollecting take place. In order for the photograph to remind me of Ruth, I have to already have met Ruth. I have to already be acquainted with her. In order for a more or less round plate to remind me of roundness, Plato says, I have to have already met perfect roundness itself. In order for a more or less just society to remind me of justice itself, so that I can start thinking about the nature of justice itself, I have to somehow have already been acquainted with perfect justice. But how and when did it happen? Not in this life, not in this world. In this world, nothing is perfectly round. Nothing is perfectly beautiful. Nothing is perfectly just. So it's got to have happened before. If seeing the photograph of my friend now can remind me of my friend, it's got to be because I met my friend before. If seeing things that participate in the forms remind me of the forms, it's got to be because I've met or been acquainted with directly with the forms before. But you don't bump up against, you don't meet, you don't see or grasp or become directly acquainted with the forms in this life. So it's got to have happened before this life. That's Plato's argument. Plato says, thinking about the way in which we grasp the forms helps us to see that the soul must have existed before birth. In the Platonic heavenly realm, directly grasping, directly communing with, directly understanding the forms. It's not taking place in this life, so it has to have happened before.